Look at a man like him, and your brain fills in the blanks before he ever opens his mouth. The scarred leather, the grinning skull stitched across his shoulders, the 900 pounds of chrome and thunder parked outside. You see a threat. You see somebody to avoid. You lock your car door a half-second faster than usual, and you tell yourself you're being smart. But late one storm-soaked night, in a truck-stop diner sitting alone off Interstate 40, a little girl no older than 7 looked at that exact man and saw the opposite of everything you'd expect. She didn't see danger. She saw the only safe harbor left in the world. And when she crossed that greasy tile floor and leaned in close and whispered 6 shaking words into the ear of a 250-pound Hell's Angel named Jackson Iron Miller, she didn't just break the silence in that room. She lit a fuse that would burn all the way up to a name nobody in that town was allowed to say out loud, and blow the lid off a secret that powerful people had killed to protect. What came next wasn't a fist fight. Not yet. It was quieter than that, and somehow so much worse. Stay with me, because this is the true story of an outlaw who became the last thing anyone expected. A guardian angel. The rain wasn't falling so much as attacking. It came down in solid gray sheets, smearing the diner's red neon into a bruise against the black Arizona night. Inside, the whole place smelled like scorched coffee and old bacon fat and rainwater soaking into rubber floor mats. The clock over the register read 11:15. Jackson sat wedged into the corner booth with his spine against the wall, eyes moving across the room out of pure reflex. That habit didn't come from the club. It came from before, from the core, from too many years spent learning that the man who watches the door is the man who walks out of it. He drank his coffee black and bitter, and it tasted like it had been sitting on the burner since noon. And he didn't care one bit. All he wanted was enough caffeine to burn through the fog of a 10-hour ride. He was not a man who invited company. 6'4", a beard that spilled halfway down his chest, forearms crowded with ink that read like a diary of everyone he'd buried. His cut creaked when he moved. He was riding alone tonight, which almost never happened for a patched member. But this ride was personal. A brother had gone down on the asphalt a week back, and Jackson was pointed toward the funeral in Albuquerque with a black mood riding shotgun. He wanted the quiet. He wanted to be left the hell alone. The diner nearly gave him that. A trucker snored face down beside a plate of cold eggs. A couple of teenagers hissed at each other in a far booth. And then, there was the kid. She'd slipped in a few minutes earlier, the little bell over the door chiming bright and cheerful, a sound that felt almost cruel next to the raw panic on her face. Pink raincoat swallowing her whole, 2 sizes too big. Sneakers caked in mud, blonde hair plastered flat against her forehead. Jackson watched her from under his cap and waited for a parent to come through that door behind her. 10 seconds. 20. The door stayed shut. Nobody came. Behind the counter, a weathered waitress named Brenda glanced up from the coffee pot, a question already forming on her lips. "Where's your mom, sweetheart?" That kind of thing. But the girl never made it to the counter. Her eyes swept the room like a bird trapped indoors, bouncing off the sleeping trucker, off the arguing teens, and then they stopped. On Jackson. Most kids took one look at him and burst into tears. Grown adults gave him a wide berth. So he braced for the flinch, the little gasp, the retreat. Instead, the girl pulled in a breath that lifted her whole narrow chest, and she walked straight at him. Past the little "please wait to be seated" sign. Past a yellow mop bucket, right up to the edge of his table, where she stopped and stood there, hands balled into trembling fists at her sides. Jackson set his mug down slow. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. He just watched her and let her come to him. She glanced back over her shoulder at the front window, where a set of headlights had just turned into the lot, sweeping through the rain. A gray sedan, plain, forgettable, the kind of car that doesn't want to be remembered. When she turned back, her eyes were flooding. She rose up on her toes and put her mouth near his ear, and her whisper came out cracked and desperate enough to land in his gut like a fist. "Please," she breathed, "pretend you're my dad." Jackson went still. Outside, the sedan rolled to a stop. Its engine died. "What?" His voice came out low and grinding, like two stones dragged together. "He's coming." Tears finally broke loose and ran down her cheeks. "Please, just for a minute. Pretend you know me." And Jackson really looked at her then. Saw the yellowing bruise circling her thin wrist. Saw the exhaustion in the way she stood. Saw a truth in those wide eyes that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. This wasn't make-believe. The door opened. A man stepped in and stopped under the light. Beige raincoat. Polished shoes that hadn't seen a puddle. Wire-rimmed glasses. He had the exact look of a substitute teacher or a mid-level accountant, completely ordinary. And to a man like Jackson, who'd spent his life learning to read the ones who hide it well, completely wrong. He didn't glance at the menu. He didn't nod at the waitress. His eyes swept the room with the patient, unhurried focus of something that hunts. Jackson made his decision in less than a heartbeat. He didn't know this girl. He didn't know that man. But he knew terror when it stood in front of him whispering, and he knew a predator when one walked through a door. He shifted his weight and slid down the bench, patting the cracked vinyl beside him. "Sit down, Sophie," he said, and he pitched it loud enough to carry across the whole room. "I told you not to go running off with your coat wide open." The girl didn't hesitate for even a second. She scrambled up onto the seat and pressed herself into his side, pushing her face into the worn leather of his cut. She smelled like rain and cheap strawberry shampoo. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she sobbed, and there wasn't a scrap of acting in it. Jackson folded one enormous arm around her, his hand nearly covering her whole shoulder, and lifted his eyes to the man now standing dead center in the diner, staring right back at him. "It's all right, Peanut," he said, low and even. "Daddy's here." The man in beige didn't so much as blink. Water dripped off his umbrella onto the linoleum while he studied the pair of them, the mountain of an outlaw with a face like an oncoming storm and the fragile little thing tucked under his arm. Brenda, sensing tension but reading the room completely backward, drifted over with the pot. "Get you folks anything? Maybe a hot cocoa for the little one?" "She's fine," the man said, cutting in before Jackson could open his mouth. His voice was smooth, polished, cold as the bottom of a lake. He took a step closer. "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. That's my daughter. Lily, she wanders off and tells stories. It's a problem we're working on." The girl went rigid against Jackson's ribs, her small nails dug in through his shirt, and she shook her head, hard, against his chest. A motion the man couldn't see, but Jackson felt clear as a shout. Jackson lifted his coffee, slow, and looked not at the man, but at the steam curling off the top. "That right?" he said. "Yes." Another step. The man reached into his coat, and under the table Jackson's fingers found the handle of the Bowie knife on his belt, but the hand came back out holding only a wallet. He flipped it open to a photo, a girl on a swing set, beaming. "See? My Lily. My name's Arthur. We've been searching for hours." It was a good prop. Convincing, even, but Jackson caught the tell instantly. In that photo, the girl wore expensive clothes, hair done up in ribbons, brand new shoes. The child clinging to his side wore hand-me-downs that hung off her, and sneakers worn clean through at the toes. "You called her Sophie," Brenda said, frowning, confused. "But he's saying." "It's a nickname," Jackson said smoothly. Then he finally raised his eyes to Arthur. "And I don't know who you are, friend, but my daughter's not going anywhere with you." Arthur's smile stayed put but never reached his eyes. "I'd hate to bring the police into a family matter. Lily, come here." "Now." The command snapped like a wet towel. The girl whimpered. No, something cold and slow began building in Jackson's chest, the particular fury that had kept him breathing in places most men never come back from. He turned his head and asked her quietly, "You know this man?" She looked up, face streaked and shining. "He's the one who took me from my mommy." The whole diner went silent. The trucker was awake now, watching. Brenda's pot hovered mid-pour. Arthur sighed and pushed his glasses up his nose. "She's unwell." "Delusions. It's heartbreaking, really, sir. I'll ask you one final time to release my daughter." Jackson stood. He didn't just rise from the booth, he unfolded out of it, boots and all, until he loomed a full head over the smaller man, the fluorescent light catching the ink on his neck. He stepped clean into the space between the girl and Arthur. "And I'll ask you exactly once," he said, dropping his voice to something almost gentle, "to get out of my face before I fold you up like a cheap lawn chair." And here's the thing that told Jackson everything. Arthur didn't flinch, a civilian would have. A real father hunting his missing kid would have been screaming, crying, dialing 911 the second he walked in. Arthur did none of it. He just stood there and measured Jackson, the hands, the stance, the patches, running the math like a man deciding whether the numbers were worth it. "You're making a very large mistake, Mr. Miller," he said softly. He'd read the name off the cut. "You've got somewhere to be tomorrow, don't you? A memorial. In Albuquerque. Be a shame if the road never let you get there." Jackson's eyes narrowed to slits. That memorial was club business. Private. Nobody outside the family had any way of knowing. "Who are you?" he demanded, just a worried father. Arthur looked past him, right at the girl. "We'll be home soon, Lily, don't you worry." And then he turned on his heel and walked out. Not fast, not panicked, just calm. He crossed the lot and climbed back into the gray sedan. But he didn't leave. He sat there with the engine idling and the headlights aimed square at the diner door, and waited. Jackson sat back down, and all the granite went out of his posture at once. "Okay," he said gently. "I believe you. What's your real name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Jenkins." "All right, Sarah, I'm Jackson. Folks call me Jax." He grabbed a napkin and wiped a smear of dirt off her cheek. "You hungry?" She nodded fast. "Brenda, burger for the kid and a chocolate shake." "On my tab." While Brenda hurried off, Jackson kept his eyes on the sedan and asked the question gnawing at him. "Sarah, how did that man know where I'm headed?" "I don't know," she said in a small voice. "But he knows everything. He found us in Oklahoma. He found us in Texas. Mommy said run." Her lip quivered. He stopped the car. He hurt her. "She told me to run into the trees and find a light. This was the only light." Jackson's stomach dropped. This wasn't a custody fight. This was a hunt, and he'd just planted himself right in the middle of the crosshairs. He pulled his phone. No bars. The storm had swallowed the tower, or they were just too deep in nowhere. The diner's landline had been dead since the rain started. He was cut off, with a child to protect and a professional idling in the lot, almost certainly calling for backup. So Jackson made a call of his own, the only one that mattered. He dropped a 50 on the table, told Brenda to lock the doors behind him and open them for nobody but the sheriff, and zipped Sarah into the front of his jacket like a kangaroo carrying its young. Then he kicked the door open into the rain. The sedan's headlights flared. Its engine snarled awake. The second Jackson's boot hit the starter. 1,200 cubic centimeters of American V-twin roared up into the storm, a sound that on any other night meant respect. But tonight was pure defiance. He felt Sarah shrink into his chest, her thin arms locked around him, her head buried under his chin, trembling in time with the machine. "Hold on tight, Peanut. No matter what. I won't let go." She cried back into the leather. He dropped the clutch. The rear tire spun, caught, and they shot out of the lot like something fired from a gun. In the mirror, the sedan lunged after them. They hit old Route 66, a black scar cut straight through the dark, rain slashing sideways in the wind and visibility down to almost nothing. For a man on two wheels, that road was a loaded gun. One slick of oil, one patch of standing water, and it was over. But he couldn't slow down. The sedan was fast, customized, its engine whining a high mean note even over the Harley, and it closed the gap in seconds, high beams flooding his mirrors, blinding him. He's not trying to stop us, Jackson understood in a cold flash. He's trying to run us off the road. He doesn't want her alive. Jackson leaned hard into a curve, a foot peg kissing the asphalt and throwing sparks up into the rain. The sedan took it wide, tires shrieking, and missed his rear fender by inches. He pushed the throttle. 80, 90, wind tearing at his helmet, rain hitting his skin like flung gravel. Ahead, the road forked. Left, the highway ran on toward Flagstaff, wide and fast, where the car owned every advantage. Right, a narrow logging road climbed up into the black timber of the national forest, unpaved, rutted, treacherous, and that was exactly why he chose it. On the highway, the car was the predator. In the woods, the odds got even. He waited until the last possible instant, faked left, watched the sedan drift to block the lane, then slammed his weight right, stood on the brakes, and let the back end break loose into a controlled skid that carried him into the gap. The sedan flew past the turn, hit the wet highway sideways, spun a full half circle, and slammed the guardrail in a crunch of metal and glass. Jackson didn't look back. He fed the Harley into the gravel, and the forest swallowed them whole. 10 brutal minutes later, arms burning, standing on the pegs to soak up every pothole, he found what he needed. An abandoned fire lookout with a little equipment shed at its base. He killed the engine, and the silence roared in. Down the mountain, faint but real, he heard it. The whine of a damaged engine, still climbing. He had her check her pockets, her shoes, anything that wasn't hers. She dug into her jeans and came up with a small silver locket. "Mommy gave me this," she said. "Never take it off." Jackson thumbed it open. No photo inside, just a blinking red light and a chip. A tracker. Her mother had never known it was there. He hurled it as far into the trees as his arm could throw. Inside the shed, he built her a nest out of old canvas tarps and jammed a shovel under the door. Then, with one flickering bar of signal, he called the only people on earth he'd trust with his life. Not the cops, because the man hunting them had known club business, had known the memorial. And a man like that doesn't buy one officer. He buys the whole department. "Talk to me," a deep voice answered. "No hello. Preacher, it's iron. I'm in it deep." He laid it out fast, a kid, 7 years old, a professional in a gray sedan, high-end tech, a hunter who'd tracked them into the woods. Cartel, maybe, government, maybe, he didn't know. But she was a target, and he was pinned. "Hold the line," Preacher said, and in the background Jackson heard chairs scraping, voices rising. "We're at the house in Winslow, Albuquerque chapters already rolling in for the memorial. Place is full. How far? 40 minutes if we mind the speed limit. 20 if we don't. Don't, Jackson said. Sitting on the floor beside Sarah, he finally asked her the question burning a hole in him. Why is that man chasing you? Who is he really? Her answer came out barely louder than the wind. He works for Judge Archer. The name landed on Jackson like a dropped anvil. Franklin Archer wasn't just a judge, he was a federal heavyweight. A name whispered for the Supreme Court shortlist, and in certain rooms, the man who quietly controlled the flow of poison up the I-40 corridor, making cases against traffickers evaporate. Why does a judge want you? Jackson asked. Because, Sarah told him, her mother had been Archer's secretary. She'd seen things, photographed papers she was never meant to touch, loaded it all onto a small drive, and hidden it inside the one thing nobody would ever think to search, the worn brown teddy bear sticking out of the top of Sarah's backpack. This wasn't a kidnapping, Jackson realized. It was a cleanup. Arthur wasn't a father. He was a man sent to erase a loose end, and the loose end was a little girl in a pink raincoat. Then the engine sounds came again, closer now. He put his eye to the crack in the door. 200 yards down the service road, headlights swept the trees. The battered gray sedan, bumper hanging loose, and behind it, 2 black SUVs. Arthur had made his own phone calls. Jackson knelt and gripped Sarah's shoulders. My friends are coming. But I have to buy them time. I'm going out there to pull those men away from this shed. You hide under the tarps, and you don't make a single sound until you hear motorcycles. A lot of motorcycles. Understand? No, she gasped, grabbing his cut. Don't leave me. I'm not leaving you, he said fiercely. I'm fighting for you. That's a different thing. He'd left his handgun in the saddlebag, a stupid rushed mistake, so he grabbed a heavy iron crowbar off the workbench, stepped out into the storm, and walked to the center of the muddy clearing. He planted his boots and gripped the bar as 3 vehicles crested the rise and washed him in blinding light. Doors opened. Arthur in the lead with a suppressed pistol. 4 more men behind him in tactical gear, carrying rifles. End of the road, Miss Miller. Jackson spat in the mud and raised the crowbar. 1 man against a firing squad. Come and get me. He roared, and it rolled like thunder, and then the ground began to shake. Not from the storm. A deep, mechanical growl was rising up out of the valley, swelling louder and louder until it sounded like a bomber lifting off a runway. Lights bloomed in the dark. Not 2, not 10, but dozens upon dozens, pouring up the mountain. The Nomad Charter and the Albuquerque chapter, 70 strong, tearing through the night as one. Arthur turned, and for the first time his composure cracked wide open. Jackson grinned, teeth white in the dark. You hear that, Arthur? That's not thunder. That's Judgment Day. The first bike exploded out of the brush, then a flood of them, circling the clearing in a wall of black steel and chrome, engines snarling. The mercenaries backed against their SUVs, weapons up but faces gone pale. Killers built for stealth, not for a frontal charge by 70 outlaws. Preacher dismounted, lit a cigarette in the rain like he had all the time in the world, and let the numbers speak. Arthur, cornered and out of moves, panicked and opened fire, and the clearing erupted. The bikers didn't retreat. They swarmed, closing the distance so fast the rifles became useless clubs. Jackson didn't run from the guns. He ran straight at Arthur, took a bullet across the shoulder that tore leather but missed bone, and slammed into him full force. They rolled through mud and pine needles, Arthur fast and vicious and trained, Jackson bigger and angrier and unwilling to let go. A headbutt, A snapped wrist. And then Preacher's voice cut through the red fog. Iron. Enough. We need him to talk. Jackson froze with his fist raised. And it was over. 2 minutes. Start to finish. 4 mercenaries zip-tied in the mud, Arthur wheezing through a ruined face. When Jackson opened the shed door and called her name, Sarah crept out from under the tarps and stepped into the light, and 70 hardened outlaws went silent, all at once. One by one they nodded at the little girl clutching her teddy bear. Not a bow. Something more like an oath. She was under the patch now. Later, in the support van winding back toward Winslow, Preacher cut the seam on the bear and pulled out a plastic-wrapped USB drive. He plugged it into a laptop, and Jackson watched his brother's face go slack, then hard. Bank records, emails, photographs of handoffs. A shaky cell video of Judge Franklin Archer himself passing a briefcase to a man with the cartel's fingerprints all over him. It wasn't just narcotics. It was trafficking. Human shipments moving up the interstate under a federal judge's signature. This brings the whole house down, Preacher said quietly. FBI, D, he'll get life, or worse. They didn't hand it to local police, who'd have made it vanish before it ever reached an evidence locker. They went nuclear. Copies to an old-school investigative reporter at the Arizona Republic who'd hated Archer for years. Copies to the FBI field office in Phoenix, to the DOJ in Washington. They left Arthur zip-tied to a telephone pole at the state line with a sign around his neck reading "Ask Me about Judge Archer," and phoned in an anonymous tip. By morning the story broke. By noon the FBI had raided Archer's chambers. By 2 o'clock he was in handcuffs, a man once whispered about for the highest court in the land, finished. But Jackson's real victory wasn't on the news. It was waking on a clubhouse couch to find Sarah on the floor, eating cereal that a 300-pound enforcer named Tiny had carefully poured for her, and watching her look up and give him the first real smile he'd ever seen from her. They found her Aunt Karen in a little coastal town in Oregon, her only living family, estranged for years, who dissolved into tears the moment Preacher got her on the phone. And so, 3 days later, the convoy that rolled north wasn't a strike force. It was an honor guard. 12 bikes, Sarah strapped safely in front of Jackson in a custom helmet, riding through red rock and pine forest and open desert while she sang into the wind and squeezed his arm every time she spotted a deer. He memorized all of it, because he already knew what waited at the end of the road. The end of the road was a small yellow cottage with a white picket fence and a garden full of hydrangeas. Everything Jackson's life was not. Karen came running down the steps sobbing her niece's name, and Jackson lifted the helmet off Sarah's head, smoothed her hair, and said, "Go on." She hesitated, looked at the house, looked back at him, her lip trembling. "Go," he said again and gave her the gentlest nudge. But before she disappeared inside for good, she ran back to the bike. Jackson reached into his cut and pinned a small silver-winged skull to her raincoat. "If you ever need anything," he said, "you show this to any biker anywhere. They'll find me." She reached up, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "I love you, Daddy Jax." He shut his eyes hard against tears that would have ruined his whole reputation, hugged her once, and let her go. Then he put on his sunglasses, fired up the bike, and rode out without looking back, because he knew if he looked back, he'd never leave. 10 years later, Jackson was president of the charter, his beard gone gray, his eyes still sharp, when a cream-colored envelope landed on his desk. A high school graduation announcement. Sarah Jenkins, valedictorian, and a handwritten note. She was headed to law school in the fall. She wanted to be a prosecutor. She wanted to be one of the good police. She still had the pen. She still told people about the angel who rode a dragon and pulled her out of the rain. She hoped he was riding safe. Jackson pinned her photo to the wall behind his desk, right beside a faded old Polaroid of a scruffy biker and a little girl in a pink raincoat in a diner booth. "Yeah, Peanut," he said to the empty room. "I'm riding safe." And that's the incredible true story of how one moment of courage rewrote 2 lives forever. Because heroes don't always show up in capes. Sometimes they show up in scarred leather, on 1,200 cubic centimeters of thunder, on the worst night of a child's life. Jackson Miller didn't have to help that little girl. He could have finished his coffee and ridden away, and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he chose to stand in the gap between a monster and an innocent. And it cost him something. And he'd do it again, in a heartbeat. If this story got to you, if you believe that loyalty and protection can walk in from the last place you'd ever look for them, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Subscribe and turn on notifications so the next one finds you the second it drops. And tell me down in the comments, if you'd been sitting in that diner, would you have had the nerve to step in? Drop the words Guardian Angel below if you're riding with Jax. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.